Good morning. Happy Friday. It's time to review some stuff for civics. This week, you guys should have been spending a lot of time looking at interest groups, and in particular, interest groups kind of in the real world. You guys should have looked up your own interest groups and collected some information. A lot of you doing PETA, which I would not have guessed out of the given options, but apparently a lot of you are interested in the silly group that is PETA. And then you also watch some ads to see how interest groups communicate with us. And you should have had that documentary about the sketchier side of interest groups, and in particular, the electioneering component. Today, I'm going to focus on just kind of going over what are some of the key takeaways from these, and also going over the different types of interest groups one more time, because it looked like when you guys had to identify ads and the types of interest groups, you guys got kind of confused there. A lot of people would mix up a few here or there. So I would just like to go over those, make sure everybody's on the same page. So with that in mind, we'll get right into it. Like I said, those are kind of our three goals for today, just kind of to clarify interest groups in the real world, what they look like, lessons we can learn, the takeaways from this week's lessons, and just going through and summarizing those interest groups again, making sure we understand the significant components of each of the ways that interest groups influence people, and then just what are sort of our key takeaways from this week. Almost like I'm starting to figure out how I want to organize these reviews. Yay. All right, so types of interest groups. You guys had 5 that you looked at. The first one were public interest groups. I just wanted to quickly kind of review that these are the ones that deal with broad issues that affect you and I. Public interest can be kind of confusing because it can apply to everything, like it's sort of a blanket group. So a lot of the ones that might seem like ideological or single issue or even professional, those also could fall into public group interest. So generally speaking, when you look at public interest, you want to think about some of the broader concepts. So like Greenpeace, they deal with the environment. The environment has a broad effect on all of us because if it stops working, we die. And therefore that becomes more of a public one. However, again, Greenpeace, that could in theory, right, be a single issue one because they're saying we care specifically about the environment. That's it. But because there's that public concern, there is the overlap there. Another good example of just exclusively public interest would be the AFV. They're a group that deals with the middle class here in the United States. They are the American Family Values Organization, and their entire purpose, if you go and look at their website, is that their motto is helping the middle class and everything that has to do with the middle class. So this one fits that public interest better because it is a broad concept. Like there's a lot that goes with the middle class. Do you want to make sure that they have good job access, that education is affordable, that housing is affordable? Like there are all these different things the middle class could potentially be worried about. But it is a large public group, like they are average people. And so they are just looking out for them, thus making them a public interest group. And generally speaking, that's what you kind of want to look for with public interest. Is there a large demographic of society that they are working to benefit? And if so, that's probably public interest. And that can be like lower class, middle class, all of the United States, all of the world, just some organization of large group of people. Single issue groups, those deal with just one specific thing. This one I also saw a little confusion with. Single issue is generally always going to be one where like you can identify one very clear, specific thing that they are concerned about. And I want to emphasize thing because usually a single issue group is tied to a specific law or a specific concept. So like Greenpeace, they are tied specifically to the environment. Yes, there's a lot more that goes to it, but at the end of the day, they're only going to care about the environment. They don't care about minimum wage. They don't care about abortion rights. Like it's always the environment, just things that have to do with that. The National Rifle Association, the NRA, they're the like quintessential example of a single issue group because they care about Americans' gun rights. And that's it. Nothing else. As long as the laws deal with that, they're concerned. But outside of that, couldn't care less. Another good example is the National Right to Life organization. They are a pro-life organization. And similarly, they care about only abortions and specifically getting rid of them. And whatever it takes to do that, whatever laws that need to be passed, that's what they support. But that's it. That's all they care about. If it doesn't directly relate to ending abortions, then the interest group is not going to put their time and money into that particular topic. And I think I wanted to end with that one too, because it's a nice transition point where single issue and ideological can be kind of confusing. Because a lot of times single issues tend to overlap with a certain type of ideology. And so ideological interest groups, they're focusing more on a core set of beliefs rather than one particular topic. And this is why there tends to be some overlap. So like, for example, the Americans for Limited Government, the ALG, is a libertarian interest group. And if you guys recall, libertarians focus entirely on less government involvement, as little government control and restriction as you can possibly have. And so there will actually be some overlap there where like they might seem like a single issue party because they're concerned about less government. That's their one issue. What I would emphasize is the fact that less government isn't really an issue so much as a mindset. And I say that because with less government comes a lot of different components. It means that there are more gun rights, there are less taxes, there is less government support for medical things. There's no public education. Like, limited government touches on every single topic in society, every aspect of society, whereas gun rights is just one single component. And so that's kind of how you need to differentiate them. Another good example of the overlap, right, would be the national right to life. That sounds like an ideological thing, right? Like you are opposed to abortions because you are concerned about the murder component. However, that is a single topic. The CCA, or the Christian Coalition of America, would be a better example of ideological because they support everything Christian in government and law. So abortion's part of that because they consider it murder because a fetus is a life. However, they also have a bunch of other religion-related topics that they push, whether it's like prayer in school or allowing people to, or allowing the government to fund private Catholic schools, like whatever the case, the Christian Coalition is going to support that as long as it forwards Christian values as a whole, not necessarily just abortion, whereas National Right to Life is just abortion. Like they would not team up with the CCA if they were working to get prayer in school. National Right to Life would be like, okay, cool, that's not really our thing. Sorry, have fun with that. So kind of to drive that point home, single issue, one tiny little aspect of society, ideological, affects many aspects, but it follows a common theme, that theme being Christian, or that theme being libertarian or conservative, whatever the case. Economic groups, I appear to have forgot to put my example on there because I am a responsible adult. However, I can still give them to you. So economic groups focus on business-related policy. And so, for example, ExxonMobil, they are a part of a oil interest group, them and a number of other groups, and those all push forward for oil-related policies, and they care about oil organizations and things like that. Kraft Foods has its own interest group that lobbies politicians for specifically changes in like things related to shipping of cheese or manufacturing of cheese. So these all deal with a specific business-related component, and so they're generally focusing not on like workers, but the business as a whole. So making the business job easier by like reducing taxes, things like that. So if the interest group is in favor of one particular business, that's going to be economic. This one, the one slight caveat would be that farmers and agriculture technically could be economic, but they could also be professional because unlike Kraft Foods or Coca-Cola, these big companies, or like, you know, ExxonMobil that deal with their business and are corporations, agriculture is primarily owned by like individuals. Even if it is a large scale farm, you don't see as many corporate farms in society, but they are still technically a business. And then that transitions nicely lastly to the professional group, which was they advocate for specific workers. So this is where I tend to suggest that you classify farmers in general, because farm organizations are advocating for the individual farmer rather than like a corporate or like farm as the business of farming as a whole. So like the Farm Bureau would be a professional interest group because it advocates for the betterment of farmers and policies that support farmers. The American Bar Association is an interest group for lawyers that advocates for regulations about how lawyers should practice their profession. And so that's one particular group. The ALA was one in your videos, the American Librarian Association, because again, they're focusing on just librarians. They're like, all right, how can we make life easier for librarians and the libraries that they run? And then even for my own organization, the National Educator Association is an interest group that would be considered professional because it advocates exclusively for teachers, whether it is for us to have better pay or additional professional development hours, things like that. So hopefully this kind of helps emphasize how you would classify each of the different groups and what you're looking for. Public interest needs to include a large body of people, whether it's middle class, upper class, lower class, whole country. Single issue is one specific topic. Ideological deals with all of the parts of society that focus on a particular theme, like limited government or Christianity. Economic deals with businesses, so like Coca-Cola, manufacturing, oil, things like that. And then professional deals with actual organizations of workers, so auto workers, librarians, educators, farmers, lawyers, things like that. So with those in mind, I now want to transition into the strategies that you guys talked about. And what I wanted to shift now is to kind of like, why did I expose you to these strategies? Why did I have you watch these videos? It was because I wanted to hopefully give you a feel for the different ways that interest groups try to affect society and which strategies tend to be more effective than others. You guys had a fourth one, which was lobbying. We're not going to deal with that one today. We're going to deal with that next week. That's going to be our focal point there. So I have not added that here. Just know that we will readdress that in more detail because lobbying has its whole separate sort of deal. We'll look at the history and its own controversy surrounding that. So getting into the ones that you actually looked at, litigating was the one where they take things to court. They represent the various groups that they are expressing interest in, and they try and fight for things on their behalf. And this one tends to be an effective way to combat injustice, but it's not super proactive. So like this is kind of the middle of the road approach that interest groups can take, where it is effective. You do see change, but it usually has to happen after something bad has happened because you have to have a law that you're going to go and fight against. For example, the Brown versus Board Supreme Court case is a perfect example of interest groups litigating to try and enact change or influence politicians. In that instance, again, it was when we were desegregating schools, and while it does not attribute them in the title, Brown versus Board of Education, the interest group, the NAACP, was the one that actually paid for the lawyers and sent lawyers to argue on behalf of the families to desegregate the schools. And in turn, this kind of emphasizes the usefulness of litigating too, is that it provides smaller groups a voice, because as we talked about when we were covering the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, you have to have a specific licensing to practice in front of them. Like not any lawyer can go and talk to the Supreme Court. And so what this allows is that interest groups can use some of their money or their influence to make sure they have lawyers on staff who are qualified to talk to the Supreme Court. And then when someone within their group needs to be represented, they can. Or when there's a topic that their group cares about that needs to be able to have someone speak before the Supreme Court, they can offer that service. Another good example would be, again, Citizens United, the fact that that one was taken in front of the Supreme Court by interest groups that were advocating for less or for more big money and interest group involvement in campaigning. And so they were able to advocate on behalf of that. But again, all these are after the fact. They're combating what the perceived injustice is once it's already taken place. So it's not super proactive. It isn't very good about getting your specific laws enacted immediately. Like if, for example, you want segregation to end, right? That was the goal of the NAACP during the Civil Rights Movement. That didn't technically happen with Brown versus Board of Education. It stopped in schools, but they still had it all over the place, and so they had to continue to fight against it. It would have been much easier if they had just gotten a law passed that said segregation is no longer legal, it's unconstitutional. Instead, they had to go the step-by-step approach because they're dealing with the problem after the fact. Public awareness is another one that you guys looked at, that was all those ads. This is, generally speaking, the easiest of the strategies that they have to try and influence you with, but the main takeaway you should have hopefully gotten from those ads is that it can really tend to have mixed results, because it's just a normal human response, right? Like, the public one can only do so much. So like, even if their ads are super effective and they get the entire public on their side, the public aren't politicians. So at the end of the day, there still might not be a change. Everybody is super concerned and angry about abortions, but at the end of the day, the politicians are like, nah, we're still going to allow them. Well, all right, cool. You spent all this money on ads, but didn't actually do anything. And then also on top of that too, the public in general just tends to have very mixed results to TV ads and ads in general. If you think about how many times Bloomberg was on YouTube trying to get you to vote for him, I would imagine that most of you became more annoyed with him as a candidate rather than in favor of him. Oh my God, I just want to watch my video. Please stop talking to me. Another like perfect example, if you've ever seen the Sarah McLachlan in the Eyes of the Angel, like adopt these sad puppies advertisement, that one kind of a poster child of moderate effectiveness ad, because everyone switched away because they're like, oh my God, I don't need this sadness in my life. And most of you, I don't think, went out and adopted puppies. So it's not super effective, but it is really easy because you basically just need to throw some money in a production company and then buy some ad time, and boom, you did it. You're advocating for your particular group or your interests. The most effective one and the most controversial one is electioneering. And that's the one that you guys watched a whole documentary on. This is what Big Sky, Big Money was all about. And it's super mixed because on the one hand, it has some really good positives in that it allows for grassroots movements, where what I mean by that is grassroots refers to a non-established group getting a candidate out there and getting their voice out there by just collecting money from donations. The PACs and interest groups that they can combine into allow them to pool their money, and they can send out ads and help fund a campaign when an individual normally could not. Generally speaking, advertising is very expensive, and so a lot of times only really wealthy candidates can afford to do it. Again, Michael Bloomberg, perfect example. That dude threw away, I believe the exact number is something like $2 billion on advertising for a failed Democratic nomination campaign, not even an actual presidential campaign. That's just not feasible for someone who's potentially running on behalf of teachers, because we don't make as much money. Or similarly, auto workers, like an auto worker candidate who used to be an auto worker is not going to have that kind of funding. However, interest groups can give them that. Now, suddenly, if this auto worker is running on the platform of, I would like to protect the rights of auto workers in, say, Detroit, Michigan, or in Michigan in general, he's running for a Senate seat. Now, the UAW, United Auto Workers Union, an interest group on behalf of auto workers, can give him money and help him run it by collecting donations from across the country, by being able to pull from the widespread influence that their organization has. However, largely the negatives that we see are associated, sorry, I thought I heard rain or something and the weather is being very weird. This is unrelated. Anyway, the negatives of electioneering are oftentimes much more significant than the positives, which is one, it strongly favors wealthy organizations. The more powerful your organization is, the more money it has to throw at the problem. And that can oftentimes drown out all the competition. A perfect example of that, again, in the Big Sky documentary you guys watched. You should have hopefully noticed the race between John Miller and John Ward, where John Ward was drowned in attack ads by interest groups. And so John Miller won without ever really actually campaigning or directly opposing John Ward or expressing his beliefs, because the interest group just used their huge amount of power in money to make the entire conversation about John Ward and how bad he was by drowning everybody in his negative press. And in the same way, it can be extremely undemocratic, because you are starting to narrow the amount of information that people have to make a decision, and in turn restricting their voices by restricting their focus, restricting the amount of information they have access to. And so that, I think, very nicely kind of brings to our key takeaways from this week, which is there are three things that I really wanted you to take away from this week's lessons and research. It's that one, interest groups can fit multiple types. There can be some overlap. It's not set in stone. Like I said, a business group might also be a professional group. It just depends on what they're advocating for. A public interest group might also be a single issue group. If it's like, say, helping the poor, like that's a single issue, but it's also a public issue. Secondly, the big takeaway is that the most effective interest groups are defined by their national presence and their large income. When you guys did your research, you should have hopefully seen that the ones that were really effective are these international, or not international, so these national organizations. The NRA is all over the United States. They have millions of members. The ACLU is all over the United States. They influence people all over the country. They have representatives in every state. And so they're effective because they have reach. Not only that they can now try and mobilize these people to support their position, but they can also pull from them as a source of income, which translates nicely to the other major benefit being that large income. Because at the end of the day, if you look back at all of the ways that we've talked about influencing politicians, it costs money. Mitigating, you have to pay lawyers. Raising public awareness, you have to be able to buy ad time. Electioneering, you have to pay people to send out mailers. You have to pay people to create attack ads. You have to pay for ad time. All of this costs money. And so at the end of the day, your interest group is going to be most effective if it has a large source of income. And that should be very readily noticeable in just the fact of which interest groups do you know the most about or have you heard about. The NRA, everybody's heard about that. Their annual income is around $400 million. So they have a lot of money to work with. PETA, 48 million, still not a lot, but or not as much as the NRA, but still a lot, and they're a more well-known one. The ACLU is extremely well-known, and they have about $230 million a year. And then AARP, a organization that works for retired people, they bring in $1 billion a year, and they have had some of the most successful attempts at influencing decisions to help the retired folk of America, and in particular with their insurance and things like that. Because money translates into ways to communicate things. And lastly, hopefully from the documentary, you should have taken away the very important lesson that Citizens United has made interest groups significantly more controversial with how it has opened up this money to be used. So now money becomes even more important to these interest groups because you need that money to be able to advocate on behalf of your organization and to manipulate those different ads. So hopefully this all kind of makes sense. You guys don't have any questions about it. Also, hopefully you're starting to really kind of define where you stand on interest groups, if you think that they're a positive component of our society or they're more problematic than anything else. Next week, we're going to be looking at lobbying in particular, and we're going to be delving into that particular aspect, the direct influencing of politicians. Everything we've looked at so far deals with how the interest groups kind of affect the public, with the exception of litigating. So now it's time to look at what they do to get directly in the face of those representatives. So hopefully this is all helpful, and you don't have any more confusion about interest groups. If not, feel free to contact me. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your day.